going up there. I don't know if they need to be. Is there a way? Should we just leave that? Just tell me when.
You can go ahead and start.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone to I nicknamed this session "Dumping the Bag." It's basically about fertility, but the dumping the bag refers to trying to maintain and produce garden fertility without bagged inputs. I'm not opposed to bagged inputs. There's some really good mixed composts and amendments on the market, and they work fine. But I'd like to encourage everybody to try to recycle what you can, and in some cases grow your own fertility inputs. So we'll be talking today about composting, and then other types of inputs, which will include leaves and some things for calcium. And then I think a large part of this session is actually going to be on cover cropping. And we're doing this in 2 sessions, so this will end about halfway through. And then hopefully you can pick up the second session and be able to listen in there too. All right, so I'm gonna begin with compost. And this is what I call a compost heap. It's just simply a pile that you can throw things in. It's kind of a slow process, but eventually I throw things on top, and the things that are there now will get buried. And as they get buried, they get shaded from the sun and they start to decompose. And it's the simplest way of composting, but it's not the most efficient because all kinds of critters can get in there and spread stuff around. If you have it enclosed, the critters can still get in there in some cases, in most cases, but they don't seem to spread it around a little bit. And then hopefully if they poop, they're going to poop right there, and it just maybe adds a little bit to your compost. So if you don't have anything else, you can start out with a heap. But what we're trying to do with compost is grow healthy crops like this. Okay, so this is a commercial version of a compost bin. Similar models are available from Gardener Supply, which is on the handout that you got. I think it's page 7 or 8, which is the resources. And then quite often some counties will have days where they actually sell these things at a discount. They may order them, and encourage people within the counties to compost rather than throw their compostables into the trash stream. So you can check with your county, whatever agency, and maybe even with your cooperative extension service, of which there is an office in every county in the United States, I believe. And the idea is you throw things in, and as you pile them up, the things on the bottom will decompose. And there's a shelf down the bottom, or a drawer down the bottom, you can take out the decomposed materials with. Now, I've helped some relatives with this, including Charlene. I think you're on the call. I found that it doesn't quite work as efficiently as they claim, because depending upon what you throw in, things can get kind of compacted. And so if you have a fork, any kind of a digging fork or something that you can use similar to that, it doesn't hurt to go in there, stick it in the hole every once in a while and kind of fluff things up. It gets it aerated, and I think it really helps the decomposition process to move on. Okay, another commercial bin. I don't know where this one was purchased from. I think this is one of the county programs. But the same idea, there's a shelf or a drawer down the bottom, you throw things in from the top, and my guess is this would be the same situation. You need to get in there with a fork every once in a while just to aerate things. Lots of homemade options. This one's built with recycled cement blocks and material thrown in one side while the other side is decomposing, and then you kind of then you switch to which side you're throwing in. And as with the other two, it doesn't hurt to fork over the stuff that's in the process of decomposing. As you can see, that pile on the right was probably last year's pile. It just happens to be a picture from our church. So there's quite a bit of yard waste that goes in here. But forking that up a little bit helps it. If you don't, it'll eventually decompose. no problem. But again, fairly low cost, and that most of that stuff's recycled. And another commercially built one. This is actually it's on a farm near us, and so this is a re-recording of the original session. I have to tell you that. You maybe figured that out already. And the person who owned this wasn't crazy about it, but several people, I think including Lynn on the call, said that they have one maybe a little bit smaller size, and it works really well, including being able to get a compost tea out of the bottom. So this one is the large one. It's fairly expensive, but Lynn was saying that she got some, she has a smaller version. It worked well. It wasn't nearly as expensive. And I think there's a link to it, but I didn't get the link down, but I think maybe on the second part, you'll see a link, a chat box on the right-hand side, and I believe she has the link down that this compost, this type of compost can be purchased from. Those of you that live in a space without, without access to a yard or don't have room to compost, another option is worm composting. On that resources handout, there in the book section, there's a book that's called Worms Eat My Garbage. And it's the best source on indoor composting. This is a commercial unit purchased over the internet. I don't know where from, but I think you can Google it and find it. It's in sections of about 4 of these plastic boxes. They have a screen on the bottom, and actually this is where the compost is being added to, I believe. And then there's a, I think on the top of it or the bottom, but I can't remember, there's a more well decomposed area, and the worms will actually crawl from one to another right through the screen. So by the time everything gets to, I think, the bottom section, maybe it's the top, things are quite well decomposed. Okay, that's the liquid that falls to the bottom. You can use it as a liquid fertilizer, and this is pretty much decomposed garbage, basically. I think, as you notice here, there's some shredded leaves there. I'm going to say shredded newspaper. It doesn't have to be newspaper, but I think the book will tell you that you need some extra carbon in there and need some things to absorb the moisture with kitchen garbage. So, a really good way to do it. This happens to be my own compost pile. It was when it was brand new, so that the newspapers were just there to, I forget why, but just maybe hold the original weeds back, but those have long since decomposed. But on the left is where you see I'm adding things, and as things get piled up there and start to decompose, I shovel it to the middle. And on the left-hand side is where the finished compost is. So I like the idea of 3 bins. Doesn't have to be modeled on this. But if you noticed, I'm going to do this with my pen. Right in, whoops. Let's see, okay, pen. Right here, there's, okay, right here and right here, there's hardware there, because this is the separation between the first 2 bins, and there's a piece of wood that goes from side to side, but then below that, it's just a hardware cloth screen right here. And it's on there on both sides with just these, what I call tractor pins, which you can pick up at Agway or Tractor Supply. I'll show you a little bit closer detail. That's what it looks like on one end, and then there's a pin, you take it out. So basically, again, this board here, I can take it out, so I don't have to shovel things all the way over the top of there. I just basically rake them over, and it saves a lot of work. I can do it on both sides, and so it just saves a little bit of work. Okay. It helps to decompose things a little bit faster if you have a way of chopping them up. I happen to have a machete, but if you have a spade or a shovel that can chop things up too, it depends upon how brown they are, or how tough they are. This happens to be peas, which are still in fairly much of the green stage when they stop producing, so it's not that hard to cut. Other things are a little bit more difficult, and it just chops things into smaller pieces. It makes the decomposition go a little bit faster, but it's not necessary. This is actually what's called a Johnson Suit composter. And I actually started out with leaf mold, which I'm able to get through our township. And those of you that may have gone to the NOFA New Jersey Winter Conference, there was a whole session on how to build and manage these. So I can't get into that much detail now, but the whole concept here is I'm going to leave this in for, it's been in for almost a year now. And I'm going to try to leave it in maybe for another year, but I should be able to start seeing mycelium grow through there. Now, what is mycelium? If you ever go through the woods and you happen to run across like a rotten log and you kick it, you often see these, looks like roots growing in, and that's probably some kind of fungal mycelium. And the benefit for trying to inoculate my soil with that mycelium is that in organic agriculture, it's reliant on bacteria, generally reliant on bacteria in the soil to decompose what's in the soil, mostly in the form of organic matter, but also in the form of minerals that are in the soil to feed the plant. But mycelium, fungal mycelium, has the ability to do the same thing. And bacteria tend to be, you know, just small and in one space, where mycelium can go for, they can stretch for yards. So they can actually pick up nutrients from the distant parts of the soil, and they actually can exchange them with the plant. There's, again, this is the whole science. We could probably have a whole course on this. But the mycelium will use the carbon that the plants excrete and to feed themselves and build themselves, and they exchange it with other nutrients. So it's basically it's kind of a whole new theory of you know, organic farming, not just organic farming, but farming in general. And I'm trying to take advantage of that, but it's still in the experimental stage. I gave you, again, a minute preamble on what could be a whole course or a whole lecture. Okay, so let me get into some other sources of potential nutrients. This is bone. It's a bone. You can see the shape of it. It's been in limestone for at least a year, possibly 2 years. I don't really remember. But that's just basically ground limestone that you can buy at any ag store that you can put on your garden to help adjust the pH and provide a little bit of calcium. So I wanted to see what I could get from this, because I had heard about this method. So that's that same bone. I can crush it in my hands and I could sprinkle that on the garden. So what's the advantage of this? Well, there's calcium in there. There's it's a lot higher in phosphorus than would be just a regular limestone. And I'm recycling my bones, and you know, kind of creating my own fertility. There's another way to do this. I find it's taking a lot longer, and that basically I'm filling up this is basically just a storage you know, a storage box that I bought at Staples. I cut out the bottom, put a screen in, drilled some holes on the side, and then basically I filled it up with bones and compost. Now, it's taking a long time. Things have been in there for over a year, and they're not decomposing nearly as fast as the bone and limestone. But I think what I need to do is add more fresh manure, which I don't necessarily have a source of. I don't have any livestock, but those of you that may have access to a little bit of chicken manure or something like that, I think it would go faster. Now, the reason I kind of got this idea, but then I found somebody else that was doing it in this method. I'm an organic inspector, so I'm on a lot of poultry farms, and basically there's always some chickens that die, you know, natural causes or something. And poultry farmers will just take those dead chickens out and they'll throw them in the compost, which is actually it's actually a chicken manure from the last time they cleaned the house out. And within a couple weeks, you can't find anything. It's just completely decomposed. So it's a you know, another method. If you happen to have a compost you get, or a manure pile that you use in your garden that you get delivered in the fall and not using it until spring, could work that way too. You could put any bones from your, may or may not be your diet. Okay, another source of homegrown fertility is we like to eat clams once in a while, and it bothered me to have to throw these away. So I built this little box, and I had some concrete that was being delivered for my when I built my shed. had some leftovers. So I told them to fill up the box, and I put these bolts in there. They're cemented in with a little rope between so I can pick it up. It's heavy. It's like 40 or 50 pounds. Maybe not quite that much. But then basically I just drop it on that. This was the shells. I drop it on there a few times. Each time I do it, it gets a little more pulverized. At this stage, you see some of it's in powder, some of it's still in, in shell. So I could spread that on the garden. The powder is going to be available immediately, and the bacterial action in the soil is going to continue to break down the rest of the shells. Or you could continue to try to crush it, either one of the two. So, again, home fertility. I occasionally do use a bag fertilizer. There is such a thing. You may think, or you might associate bag fertilizer with 10-10-10, which is a chemical. But there are a lot of really good composts, compost-based fertilizers that are available on the market, made for compost. I think several people mentioned some that are based on sea waste products, from the fishing industry, lobster industry, whatever. So they're good things. I do use this on my strawberries because I do not want to risk bringing in weed seed from my compost. I do not hot compost, so there's quite possibly weed seeds or just cucumber seeds or whatever from our garbage that are left in there, and I don't want to get them in my strawberries because I have to hand weed my strawberries. So I try to eliminate any possible source of weed seed. Same with the blueberries. I have blueberries, and I use bag fertilizer in there because I can get some organic mixes of blueberry fertilizer. It's compost based, but it also has a lot of sulfur in it to lower the pH of the soil. Another source, basically, this is a mushroom soil. There is a garden supply store near us called Rosedale Mills, and I know a lot of people on this call are from my county because originally we were going to have this is an in-person meeting, and so a lot of the initial registrants are expecting in-person. Rosedale Mills sells mushroom compost, and they get theirs from organic sources. I think you can probably find sources that will deliver a whole truckload, but if you have a garden, you probably can't use it. Whereas the garden supply stores, you can go in with a bucket or a pickup truck. Pickup truck, they'll probably cost you a little bit more to fill it up, but buckets, you can get small amounts. It's good stuff. I can't remember, it's either a little high in something, which you don't want to build up, or it's low in something, and I don't remember what or why, but it might be sodium. And the reason for, if it was sodium, mushrooms will, after a while, a mushroom house can start to have some diseases pop in. And the way they control it organically is to put salt on that area of the compost. So it's quite possibly it's sodium. So I wouldn't rely on it only, but it's a good source. Grow some good things. So I don't have a sophisticated way to spread things. I just do it by the shovelful, and no problem with that because I usually plant one bed at a time. Just kind of sprinkle it on, or you can plant the whole. I guess I'm getting holes ready here to plant peppers. And you can just sprinkle some in the hole. Doesn't hurt to have some in the bottom of the where the roots are. You don't want to bury them too deep because you need some aeration in that soil to break down the nutrients that are in the compost and make them available to the plant. And it doesn't hurt to put them on the top of the soil. But if you do put them on the top of the soil, you should rake them in lightly. I'll get to that a little bit later. Okay, going through. I'm in a different topic now. Still inputs that you can gather on your own. But this is leaves. I grow in raised beds. Those are raised beds. They don't have wooden sides on them. I don't. It would have been much too costly to put wooden sides on my whole garden. These are about 30-foot long beds, and I don't really think you need them. But a lot of you have a wooden or plastic sized bed. They're fine. But I go collect leaves around my neighborhood all fall long. I keep a couple of bags in my car every time I go up and down the street. and I get a minute, I fill up a couple of bags. And the way I utilize them is I fill up my pathways between my beds with leaves. And as I walk over them, it kind of pats them down. They're probably about 8 inches thick to start with, but then as I walk over them, it becomes less and less. And it's kind of a good way to store leaves over the winter. And also, I often walk in the garden over the winter time, or late fall, when sometimes the soil is soaking wet, and it kind of protects the soil and the pathways from getting compacted if I'm walking on it when it's wet, and it saves my shoes from getting muddy. Not that I don't take them off when I go from the garden to the house, but you can bring a lot of mud in if you're walking on bare soil. If you have the option, there are different types of leaves available for all of us. In my area, we have a lot of ash. It's my favorite because the leaves are very curled and very brittle, so they break down really well and whatnot. But our ashes are all dying from the emerald ash borer. Probably second favorite would be maple. They seem to be a fairly light leaf. Oak is probably my least favorite because they tend to mat down, and sometimes water won't penetrate as well. If you have a shredder and you shred those up, then they would work fine. I do have a shredder, and sometimes if I forget to get leaves early, oak is the last to fall, oak and beech, and those would, I would shred those up if I use them. But I have some areas where I want shredded leaves anyways, and I happen to have a shredder, so I can do it. Okay, this is what it looks like in the spring. You can still see the leaves there. The strawberries are just coming in, strawberry blossoms, so it's probably early May. But eventually, if I didn't do anything with these, I keep walking them, the leaves basically disappear after a while. Where do they go? They basically just decomposed. But a lot of times, well, I have different ways of managing leaves in different beds, but the other area I want to show you, I have a raspberry patch. I manage them as fall raspberries, which means I cut them down every year. So this is early spring when they're all growing from the ground, or probably mid-spring. But this is what that patch looks like in probably November. You see the canes there. Now I will cut those canes out, but you can see the mulch. Basically, I just cover the whole bed with mulch, with the leaf mulch. That's the only fertility that's gotten excited from a little bit of boron, which I tried one time, and I'll talk about that a little bit later when we get into the soil test.
Hey, Al?
Yes.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
So you said you treat them as fall raspberries.
Yes.
What happens if you leave the canes and don't cut them down?
I don't know, because I almost had that happen. I have a part of this patch had gotten apparently a disease. I actually sent it away to the lab at Rutgers, and they said I have Phytophthora, which means I might lose the whole patch. But I didn't want to cut them back. Okay, so here's the canes. Same day, I cut them back to, you can't see anything there. I didn't want to do that until I heard back from what my problem was, and I kind of delayed this. And so some of my canes, by the time I pruned them back, it was actually March, they had started to have little buds that produce leaves. And so it looks like they will produce, more raspberry plant, but whether or not they would have produced fruit that year, I really don't know. I think they might have, and the fruit would have come on earlier, probably would have come on in July as opposed to August and September, which is what I want my fruit to come in. So, but I don't know the exact answer to that, but my guess is you could. Now, this is a variety that's bred for doing well in the fall, but I think it probably could be managed as a summer bearing variety.
Okay, thanks.
But I don't know that for a fact. Good question, though. Okay, so basically the little canes, they have no problem shooting up through the leaf mulch. They're strong enough, they'll come right up there. So so I'm going to get into bed forming a little bit more detail later on, but so it's time to plant my early crops. It looks like this is my onions that I'm getting ready to plant, because it's the same bed as garlic, and that's garlic growing in the background. So I want to take advantage of the soil in the pathway in which I have new leaves on now, but then there were old leaves last year. So I rake the soil back when I get ready to make my beds ready for planting, and I figure I've had a little bit of erosion from the side of the bed over the course of the previous growing season anyways. So I rake those leaves back for half of the pathway, and then I drag a little bit of soil from the pathway back up into the beds. I figure that there's nutrients leaching into that pathway soil, and I want to take advantage of them. And again, it's just a way of negating some of the possible erosion that happened the last summer. Now there are times when I'll actually rake those leaves into the bed and chop them in. Now this is a bed that I would be getting ready to plant cucurbits in, which is your melon, squash, cucumber family. And those will get planted till later. And I've always noticed that in the compost pile, a lot of times pumpkins will start to grow. We probably have all seen that. So it's my theory, I don't know for a fact, my theory that the leaves don't have to be as well composted for that family as they do for others. But again, just that's my idea. Basically just chop them and drag them up and chop them into the soil. Now the problem with chopping these into the soil is that the bacteria in the soil are going to start decomposing this. And they while they're doing that, they tie up the nitrogen in the soil. They don't make it available to the plants. So you can get a little bit of slower growth, but the cucurbits will probably not start growing for about a month and a half after this process. So I was hoping that it would provide enough time. And I only did this once. I don't remember there being any problem, but I don't remember the specific year either. Okay, other mulches, just straw. I think somebody asked about the difference between straw and hay. Straw is it's the stalk of a grain such as wheat or rye or barley that's been harvested, and there's probably a little bit of grain seed in there, but not too much. Hay is just a feed that's been cut for livestock. Usually if it gets beyond the stage where it's made good livestock feed, it's too old, it's cut for mulch. I call it mulch hay. It's cheaper, but there's an awful lot of seed in the mulch hay. In the hay that's for livestock, there's probably a bunch of seed in there too. It's not going to be as much as there is for the mulch hay. And the straw, which is usually even more expensive than the hay, it has less seed in it, and the seed is usually just of those grains, which are pretty easy to control, as opposed to potentially bringing in things like perennial thistle or something like that from some hay. So the other place where I use the straw mulch is my potatoes. Potatoes, I do that for several reasons. One is, the main one actually, is that the potatoes, as they form, some of them will be on the surface of the soil and they'll turn green, which I'm told not to eat a green potato. So the mulch can kind of cover those up. And now, as well as that, they're shading the soil from weeds and decomposing to add fertility. This is about fertility, really, amongst other things. So, or mainly. So, okay, I'm going to talk, I think, pretty much the rest of the class on cover cropping and some of their effects. And I'm going to go through quickly and show you some photos of various types of cover crops, and then get into planting and some more details. Happens to be a photo of cover crop grown in the fall. Happens to be from Minnesota, or my daughter worked on this farm. It is actually oats and peas and flax. It's nice to plant a mix of cover crops, because sometimes one will grow well and the other one didn't. So you at least get something. In this case, it was probably all three those seeds planted, and they all seem to grow. I'm not going to talk anymore about flax. I don't know much about it. It's maybe more of a Midwestern cover crop. But I will talk more about the oats and the peas. You have this resource. It's pages 5 and 6 deal with cover crops in your handout. And this is a list of the cover crops that I will be talking about. I think I'm going to talk about all of them. It gives you a little bit of outline. I'll go through each one of them. but some of them in more detail than others. But the other thing on here is that I've got a little, at the end of each crop, I've got in parentheses, or maybe just on another line, of how you can obtain this. So for instance, you look at winter rye, it's most of that you can get locally at your supply stores. The ideal time to plant that is anytime after August 15th. A problem sometimes you run into with is the garden supply stores don't necessarily keep track of this, and so they won't get their order in until like the end of September, which is it's getting a little late, but rye you can actually plant up until November. Let's go down a little bit. Let's see, get that pen out. So, okay, red clover right here. So I'm gonna, sell by all suppliers. Okay, so basically, local, you often can get that local. And when I say local, sometimes your garden supply store say, well, you can buy a 50-pound bag or something. But most of the common ones, they'll break up the bags if they have it in bulk. But at the bottom, you'll see seed supplies and source. So there's a code under each thing. Fedco, for instance, you see it in red on the red clovers, and Fedco is down here. It's a seed catalog company, and that's how you can access them. Johnny's is one that's on here now, and I think we might have mentioned that last week. Right now, because of the COVID virus lockdown, Johnny's is only selling for a couple of weeks to their commercial customers, their farms. They said they've got a 2-week lockout of gardeners to make sure all the farms that are relying on this for their livelihood get the supplies that they need. So some of these you may have trouble getting the seed right now, but thinking long term, if you make an order and you use the seed catalogs or seed online, think about getting some cover crops next year or the next time you order if your local stores don't have it. Okay, so I order a bunch. I usually order a minimum of a pound or two, depending upon, and maybe even up to 5 pounds. And basically, I just store it in coffee cans or jars. And most of the stuff will last for a number of years, except for the ones that are actually grains, like wheat, rye, barley, oats. Those don't have as long of a shelf life, and they can get infested with weevils. Either it came with it, or they can find their way in, whatever insect that is, can find their way into the jars if you don't have a perfect seal. You can extend the life of those grains by putting them in the freezer. It doesn't hurt, because if they were outside, they'd fall off at a certain time of year and they get frozen anyways. So you can basically, so I put these in my basement where it's 55 degrees in the winter time, and as long as they're sealed, they're not getting any particular additional moisture. It's cooler down there in the summertime. I think it's about 75. So, basically ambient temperature, and I've used some seed I've used up for 5 years. Okay, a couple of other quick photos of crops. It's a winter rye. So it's planted in the fall. I don't know exactly when this planted, but this photo was taken Thanksgiving weekend. Another fall crop of, I think it's rye and vetch. But this is a fall crop. It was planted earlier, and it's doing quite well. These will not die over the wintertime. They'll come back, and I'll have to manage them in the wintertime. But I get the crop in the fall. Another crop of straight vetch. It was probably planted with a grain, but the grain didn't die. Didn't grow. I think it was because it had weevils. That's my guess. Okay, clovers. 2 different types of clover here. In the background is a red clover. It's a larger plant. It has some applications. It's easier to actually incorporate into the soil because it grows from a taproot. In the front is white clover. You probably have seen white clover growing in your lawn. You see clover, and then you see these little white flowers. This is a type of that white clover. I have an application for it, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. It's a little harder to kill because it has these roots that are not tap roots. They kind of are more hairy and they'll grow out and spread. But it's both of these are legumes as well as the hairy vetch we looked at. And legumes have the ability to take atmospheric nitrogen and fix it in the soil, so it creates more for the next plant. Okay, another part of your handout is page 6, and this is a management schedule. I'm not going to go over this. I'm going to go over I think all the information on here, but then I will. You'll need to circle back to your handout in order to remember all this stuff if you don't write it all down. Okay, so planting, cover crop planting. Basically, the only type of planting I do is I just fill up a cup, a bag or something with the seed, and I just sprinkle it by swishing my hand back and forth over the top of the bed. You don't want to rototill or anything that seed in there. You can rake it in a little bit. Most of the grains don't mind being on the surface of the soil. What is important though is to get a good soil compact. So good soil contact. And you can do that by going over the just planted bed with the back of your hoe or some other similar. I think if you have one of those big rollers, it's too much weight on the bed, but something like the back of a hoe rake seems to work quite well. And what that does is it creates good soil contact. So you see this is a crop that was planted just by broadcasting the seed on the top of the soil. It was done in early spring. It was probably the same crop that you just saw me tamping in. And it was a mix of oats and peas. As you see, the oats are a little bit faster growing than the peas, but those were not buried. Those are sitting on the top of the soil. There might have been some that got buried a little bit, but they had really good contact with the moisture in the soil. I don't know if I had to water this at all after I planted it. Usually the soil moisture lasts for a long time in the spring, and this was probably planted in late March or early April. Both of those crops will do fairly well in the early spring when there's plenty of moisture in the soil to just start the crop growing again. I actually did have a couple of beds that I planted last September, and we had a dry spell in September. I planted, I think, rye and hairy vetch, and they did not do very well. So I replanted them with oats and peas, and I did that about March 9th. I looked at the two-week weather. It looked like it was going to be enough rain and warm weather. I tried to plant them, and the oats are doing fine. The peas didn't seem to germinate that well. There's some peas that are growing, but not that much. But at least I'll have a cover crop of oats on there for a couple of months before I'm actually ready to plant those beds. So I'm always thinking ahead and thinking of, okay, what can I get on here to grow? It's going to be using the nutrients from the soil to prevent them from leaching. But in some cases, if you get those nitrogen fixing crops, like the peas are also another legume, going to be creating some more nitrogen for the next crop too. So, another planting tip is if you have an open bed in the middle of the summertime, you can plant buckwheat. Let's see. So buckwheat likes hot weather. It does not like to be planted in the spring or fall. It germinates in the warm soil, but the problem with planting in the warm weather is sometimes the soil gets dry, so you might have to water it. I have a job that I am often away, so I'm not around. I like to use a row cover. This is actually it's called Agribon. It's available I know it's available from Johnny's Selected Seed. The minimum you have to buy is a 50-foot roll, and this is the narrowest. It's like 86 inches wide. It is weight number 19. If you get heavier, as the numbers go up, it's probably like pounds per 100 lineal feet or something like that. As the numbers go up, it gets heavier. So the heavier ones will protect you more from the frost, but that's not my purpose here. My purpose is just shade a little bit of the soil and preserve the moisture in the soil. So 19 seems to be a good weight. And I know that Johnny's early this spring, they had a special on this particular roll, which is 50 foot by 86 inches wide. 19 weight. It was selling for $11. Now 50 foot's probably a lot longer than a lot more than you'll ever need. But you know, if you can share it with neighbors, or I use these things for 5, 6, I think, you know, maybe more years in a row, as long as you don't have groundhogs walking over, which could be an issue, or raccoons. They seem to last quite a while. Because it's not out all summer long. If it was out all summer long, it'll probably get deteriorated. But so what I'm doing with this is just okay. Another way to preserve the moisture in the soil is just to mulch the cover crop that you've just planted very lightly with straw. Again, I wouldn't use hay here, because hay would mat together and wouldn't have those air pockets for the stuff to grow through. Yeah, just another application of that. Just one was clover. This is an oat crop planted. And the last method, I guess I got back to buckwheat. The last method is what I call frost seeding. We've all seen ground in March that has these cracks in it. Any open ground, not any open ground, but often you see open ground in March that has cracks in it. So that's what you call frost heaves. So in March, the soil generally has a fair amount of moisture in it. So when you get these cold nights, you know, what happens to water when it freezes? It expands. So it causes the soil to expand, and then when it warms up during the day, it contracts, but it leaves these cracks. So this is, again, it's probably mid-March, and I had an area that the cover crop did not establish well the previous fall, and I wanted to establish clover. So I broadcast clover here. Let me show you about a week or 10 days later. This is the same area, a little bit more close up, but you can see there's cracks there, the same cracks you saw in the previous photo. But where is the clover germinating? It's germinating in the holes, in some cases the holes, and also in the cracks. Some of those holes might be cracks too. So what happened is some of the seed fell into those holes. Those holes are a little bit deeper, so the moisture stays there longer, and they're shaded from the sun, so it basically stays moist longer. And so I get better germination. It's not you know, not getting it in every square inch, but there's enough clover growing there that I can get a good stand of clover. So you can only do this on those days when not early spring, probably late winter, early spring for some of you guys that are coming in from the north, like Rochester, or whatever. When the frost is heaving, and I mean, sorry, the soil is heaving from the frost. And yeah, you keep an eye on your weather. You look for cold, really cold nights below freezing and warm days. Okay, another way I get them planted is I grow a bed of cucurbits every year. What is that? That's squashes, winter squashes, summer squashes, cucumbers, melons. And in that bed, I continue to weed, and I'll get into my weeding methods more on week 3, or I talk about pests. I consider weeds a pest. But there's a time when I can't get in there with my weeder anymore, because these vines are starting to grow and take over the bed. So at that point, I broadcast white clover in the bed of cucurbits. And sometimes I get a better stand than others, but it takes only one good rain to germinate that seed, because there's enough shade from the leaves that a good rain will germinate the seed. Now it takes another good rain or two for that seed to thrive, because if it dries out when it's really small plant like this, which it can, even with the shade from the leaves, it will die. So you probably need to water if you don't get that second rain within a couple of days after the first one, and probably 3 or 4. Again, sometimes you saw earlier in my photos where I had a bed of white clover followed by a bed next to a bed of red clover. That white clover had been this cucurbit bed the year before, and I got a beautiful stand that year. Don't always get that good of a stand. Now, where did that red clover come from? Again, it's part of my planting scheme. In the bed next to my cucurbits is where I plant my early crops, like my early lettuce, my peas, anything else I want to put in there and hopefully have out by midsummer. And as I pull those crops out, I also plant clover there. Now I plant red clover. It's a bigger plant. I don't plant it in the bed that the cucurbits are actually growing in because I'm afraid it'll compete too much with the growing crops. Where white clover just, its roots are on the surface of the soil, so I don't think it competes that much. But then it allows those vines to go into the next bed where I'm trying to establish another crop of that red clover, and the fruit can lay right on the surface. But here's this bed of early lettuce. It looks like that lettuce is either one that's already been harvested or it's a runt that never grew. But there's weeds in there, but a lot of those little tiny seedlings you see are clover. So that's going to create a clover crop next to the cucurbit bed. And this clover will actually stay in there for a whole season. I won't, the whole next year, it's going to continue to be clover because I move my cucurbit bed over 2 beds every year. So there's one established clover bed on one side of it, which is kind of like my bed that rests every year. Out of my 7 beds, one of them's resting. It's in clover every summer. But that gives those cucurbits another bed to spread out in. The winter squashes will kind of take over the garden. Pumpkins are particularly notorious for that. They're such a strong vine that they'll take over the whole garden. But again, I have the cucurbit beds in the middle, and eventually I'll have 2 other clover beds established on either side. So other planting schemes, you can see on the left-hand side, those are tomato vines. And late in the season, those bottom leaves are, you see at the top of your screen, they're dying, but the top has a lot of growth to it, and you still see some tomatoes that are ripening. But this is a crop of winter rye and hairy vetch. Hairy vetch, it's a legume, and you may or may not be familiar with it. We can see right there that weird looking leaf right there is a hairy vetch. But I put this in early September. Central Jersey, our tomatoes were usually harvested until October. And this crop is being shaded right now by the top growth of the tomatoes, but it's established. And as the tomatoes die out more and more as the fall goes on, it opens up sunlight, and that will be a really beautiful crop of hairy vetch and winter rye, which I will again plow in the next spring. Okay, cover crop management, planting schedule and growth. Okay, so again, your rye, generally winter rye, the best time to plant that is starting about the middle of August. You may or may not have an open bed. And if you're going to plant it in the tomato bed like you just saw, I would wait a little bit, maybe wait till early September, early to mid-September. It can be planted up till November, and still you'll get a small growth in November. I guess there probably could be some years where the conditions would not be great, but you'll get a nice stand. Again, it's called winter rye because it'll overwinter. It's meant to be planted in the fall and overwinter. Let's see. Again, this is that crop we saw earlier under my tomatoes, but at this point the tomato vines had died. I think this is probably the day where I removed those from the garden. And basically, yeah, probably the same day. That part of the bed, it looks like the rye didn't take, and I know I had some seed that had weevils in, and I figured I'll plant them anyways and probably get some to grow, but they didn't. So, but that's a solid bed of hairy vetch. The peppers I just happened to leave in there. I probably cut that day and hung it up in my basement, and we just picked those peppers off all winter long, just from the basement. Okay, oats. Several applications. Oats grow really quickly in cold weather, so you can plant them in the fall, and you'll get more growth than you will out of rye, but they don't overwinter, so they'll die back. Now that has an advantage. This is probably a bed, if I planted this purposefully, which I probably did, that I want to plant an early crop the next spring. So the oats are going to get a good cover crop off it in the fall, but over the winter they'll die. So I don't have to worry about like chopping in or incorporating a cover crop in there. The dead matter will still be there, but it's a lot easier to deal with, or I could rake it off. But it also has another application, and because they like cold weather, you can plant them early. You can plant them early in the excuse me, early in the spring, which I talked a little bit about that. And this is another example of the cover crop that was planted in the spring of oats and peas. It's a little hard to see the peas. They did a little better in some places. Actually, those are planted peas in the upper right-hand corner, but that's a different bed. A little bit better picture of the peas, probably the same bed. In some places, the peas did better than the oats, and sometimes vice versa. The advantage of this cover crop is that in the spring, again, the peas will die over the winter. You can replant those of the oats in the fall if you want. And they're supposed to die over the winter. Sometimes it's not quite cold enough. But these are little pea shoots that will grow off the cover crop. And you can harvest those and make a salad out of them. It's basically, or make a salad or just eat them. They're sweet, not as sweet as, quite as sweet as the pea seed, but they're sweet and they're tender. And it's one of the earlier greens that we get from the new crop. Clover, again, this was, I went through my planting scheme, so I don't need to repeat that here. But this is probably a year where I had 3 beds of clover. This one's being left in because the cucurbits, this year's cucurbits are going to be planted to the right of that. But the other 2 I've already started preparing for planting, which I'll get into a little bit more detail. And you can see this is that established clover crop from the year before, that the vines, that's probably melon or butternut squash vines that are starting to grow into that. So it gives it a lot more room to spread out. A couple other applications of cover crops. The white clover is a good one for pathways. This is a permanent pathway. My beds that you've been looking at go off to the right. On the left is my blueberry patch. And this is a permanent pathway. And I got a really nice establishment of clover here. I think I planted it in the fall. It's really good for walking on too. And yeah, does it tend to grow into the blueberries? Yeah, sometimes. And I just pull it up by hand. You're not killing the whole plant because they have extensive roots, and I use it for mulch or compost. It's not that hard to control. Crimson clover, it's on that handout. I don't use it too much, but it's a clover that will generally die over the winter time. But they say as the winters are becoming warmer, it's dying less and less. So if you have an application where you want to get some clover on, but you want to use that bed early in the spring, you can try crimson clover. It's a beautiful plant. If you plant it in time to flower up, it's really nice. Clover, again, probably red clover, but as I've gotten to be a better gardener, I've find out more that clover does a great job of fixing nitrogen. It's a legume, but it will fix more nitrogen if it's interplanted with a grass or some other type of plant that does not fix nitrogen but needs nitrogen to grow. So I did a bunch of experimentation with different things and came up with perennial rye. It's different than the rye grain that's called winter rye. This is a rye that you would plant if you're planting a lawn. Generally, lawn mixes are rye's, fescues, perennial rye, fescues, and Kentucky bluegrass, and may or may not have some clover in the mixes. But the perennial rye is the quickest growing of those 3, but it also dies out the quickest too. So you have an established lawn, you probably don't have much much perennial rye in there. It might be all Kentucky bluegrass and fescues, but the fact that it dies out fast meant that it was probably the best one to mix in. And this is a pretty good stand. You can see the rye in there, and it's mostly clover. So where do you get this stuff? I don't know if it's available from any of those seed resources. I think maybe Fedco's might have it if I remember. You'll have to look on there. But if you have a local garden supply store, some of them will make their own grass mixes. In other words, you go in there, you say, I want to plant grass in a shady area, 80% shade or something like that. Say, oh, we'll mix up, we'll make this mix up. So in other words, they have the components to mix it up. And in those places, you can go in there and buy straight perennial rye grasses. Otherwise, I think you might be it might be a little hard to get from the catalogs, but this is kind of an advanced part of this, so you may or may not be able to get anything. You can try some of the grains, but I think the grains have a different, they have such a different growing system than the clovers that I don't think they mix in that well. Sometimes I get a bed that the clover didn't do that well, but it turns out to be all perennial rye. Not a bad thing. Perennial rye, again, it'll seed up, so it'll continue to spread, but you can cut it and keep cutting it. I happen to have a machete, so I cut it by hand. Some of that's going in my pathways. I just let it go, and then I'll use it for mulch or maybe take it to the compost pile. And I think that brings us up to part 2, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, Al, that's perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. All right, so I'm going to hit stop. All right.